And we are live on Ham Radio DX. Welcome to everyone watching this evening on the stream. Tonight we have another special shack tour and discussion. This is number 4 in the series. But before I begin those on the live stream, there's a few coming in now. I think we've got 7 or 8 so far on the stream. Please feel free to leave comments and questions in the live chat box. It'd be great to see some of your comments tonight. If you're watching this later, also feel free to comment below on what you thought of this and the series of the shack tours that's been happening. So, and also please subscribe to the channel, as it gives me more motivation to keep making these videos and doing these live streams and sharing the amateur radio related content. So, right, well, with that out of the way now, we have our number 4 in the shack tour, and what I'd like to do is introduce to you Theo, VK5IR. He is located in Adelaide, South Australia. Theo is very active in the hobby and he enjoys many different aspects of amateur radio. So welcome, Theo. It's great to have you on tonight and thank you for being a part of this.
Hello, Hayden. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're up to 6 or 7 still watching. We've got ZL2 Foxtrot Tango, Jason in, so that's good. Digital Analog Ham says hi. We've got Sandra Abaka in there as well. So yeah, we've got a few viewers. So Theo, tell us what sparked your interest and how did you get into amateur radio?
Okay, so to explain that, I'd probably have to start back when I was a kid. It started with what I call my CB craze. So as a kid, excuse me, in the mid 80s, I would have been about 6 or 7 years old. A family friend of ours had a 40-channel AM CB radio installed in his car. And one night his kids were showing it to me and I was absolutely amazed. And we were just talking to people all over town and I just couldn't believe it. I hadn't seen anything like that before and fell in love with it. Anyway, that night or the next day, I asked my dad if we could get a CB in our car. And his response was, yeah, one day we'll get one, which basically told me, don't hold your breath. It might happen one day, but it might not happen at all. Fast forward sometime later, I don't know how long ago it was. I don't know. Yeah, it could have been years later. I can't remember. But one day my dad called me over to the car. He had it in the driveway and he wanted to show me something. And I got in the car and he had bought and had professionally installed a General Electric 40-channel AM CB radio. Couldn't believe my eyes. Anyway, had a lot of enjoyment with that, just chatting to people around town as a kid while dad or mum was driving. And he used to leave it on channel 8, which back then was what I call the truckie channel.
Yep.
Anyway, so one day, now this was in Ballarat. I was born in Ballarat. Dad and I were driving around in the car. He was running some errands. I don't remember what we were doing, but
and this would have been around the boom of CB radio too, wouldn't it? When it was getting popular.
Well, I would say so. I mean, like I said, I was about 6 or 7, so I placed that 1986, 87, somewhere around there. I think, I don't know, maybe the CB craze started in the 70s, but that's when I got introduced to it. So anyway, we're driving around, cruising around town one day in Ballarat. Some guy gets on the radio and says, does anyone want to buy a base station radio? AM and sideband base station CB and an antenna. And my old man picked up the mic and said, yeah, I'll come and have a look at it. I don't know why he showed any interest, but anyway, he went and had a look and the radio was a Uniden Pro 810E. AM sideband 40-channel radio. It was in as new condition. This thing was immaculate. It mustn't have been very old. And the antenna was the Station Master 11-meter vertical.
Yep.
Anyway, he bought it, took it home, and we had it set up. I still remember the day the guys from Ballarat Communications were there to install the antenna and run the coax into the house. And anyway, once we'd set it up, we went inside. The guy that was setting it up fired it up. And the first contact we made, well, the first contact I can remember was to a guy in New South Wales on sideband. This was my first taste of sideband. I still remember him tuning the other guy in with the clarifier, and him sounding like Daffy Duck. Anyway, as soon as he spoke to this guy in New South Wales, I was amazed. The bug had bitten me, and I fell in love with it. And I used that radio almost every day and every night from then on. Just sitting there in the evenings chatting to people around Ballarat on the old Channel 11 AM and listening to all the rat bags on there. And then when I could, I'd get on sideband and work people all around Australia. And I got an absolute buzz out of it. I remember people talking to me. I'd be talking to guys interstate, and they'd say to me, you know, I was only young. They'd say to me, "You're a little boy or a little girl?" Because I was quite young, had the squeaky voice and all that. So, yeah. So anyway, got a real kick out of it. Anyway, in 1994, we packed up and moved to Adelaide. I was 13 years old. We brought the radio and the antenna with us. Had it set up in the new house here in Adelaide, and I started to play with that quite regularly. And again, I'd work people all around Australia on it. I'm getting to amateur radio, but yeah, this is the story as it goes.
I think we all, and it's a story that resonates with everyone. We sort of made a start, I think, at some point with CB radio.
I think a lot of us did. I know there were those who just jumped straight into it, but you know, this is how I got into it through the CB, and I absolutely loved the CB at the time. So yeah, I remember one particular afternoon I was sitting there and I was on Channel 27. I don't know, someone told me Channel 27 is where you hear some of the South Africans on lower sideband. And one afternoon, probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I managed to work a guy in Pretoria in South Africa, and I was sitting there screaming my address into the microphone so he could send me a QSL card. You know, there was a bit of fading, a bit of QSB, and you know, conditions weren't great, but there I was talking to a guy in South Africa, and it was very rare to make an international contact for me on the CB. There was a few Americans. I'd hear more than I would be able to speak to. I remember the big signaller, Alan from Hawaii, always had a massive signal up on 38 or 39 upper sideband, I think it was. But, you know, I was never really lucky enough to work too many of them. So to work this guy in South Africa was an absolute buzz for me. So during my time as a teenager, probably at that time I was about 14 or 15, anyway, I logged this guy in South Africa, by the way, and I've still got the logbook and I've still got the QSL card in the shed somewhere. Anyway, 14 or 15 years old, my mum took my brother and I once a month to one of the public libraries in the local area. In the public library, I happened to be going through the magazine rack one day, and I saw these magazines called Amateur Radio Action.
Yes.
And on the front cover, there were these amazing looking, what I thought were CBs. Oh, geez, these things look high tech. I started borrowing these magazines and reading them. And, you know, I was amazed that these CBs could talk to people internationally so easily. Eventually, I discovered that this was amateur radio. I developed a huge interest in it. And I used to borrow these magazines and just read them. I think I borrowed them and I read them all. As soon as a new one would come out, I'd reserve it, go and take it home and read it. And we wouldn't be, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting because Amateur Radio Action was before I was interested in radio but I've gotten old copies of them, and they were a very great magazine. There was so much information in those, and it's just, you know, I'd be the same. I got older copies and I'd be reading through them, and then I'd go and finish one, and then I'd go, oh, well, I'll get the next one because there's an article that interests me in that one.
I've got boxes full of them.
Yeah.
They come up on eBay one day and I grabbed them for next to nothing. And I remember for a period of time, I used to have a job in the town that required me to get the bus, and I just read all of them on the bus to and from home. And it was amazing being able to read those books again. But yeah, not a day would go by where I wasn't thinking about amateur radio. But I was in year 9 or 10 and couldn't really do a lot about it. I wanted to get my license, but the Morse code requirement put me off, obviously. You know, I was busy with school and, you know, wasn't really motivated to sit there and try and learn Morse code at the time. Anyway, when I was about 16, I was introduced to a radio tech named Ian, who I now know is known quite well around Australia as who they call the Yellow Dot. because every radio he worked on, he put a little round yellow sticker on the back of the radio, so you would know. So he would know that he had worked on that sticker in the past. He developed quite a reputation, and then to a lot of people that I knew, if the yellow dot had worked on your radio, you know it was in good hands. Anyway, Ian had a mobile phone that he had 2 phones, but there was one number he gave out, and this number wouldn't be it'd be off during the day, and he'd turn it on about 8 o'clock every night. You couldn't get a hold of him before that. And you'd ring him up and organise for him to organise a rendezvous at the local BP service station, which happened to be not far from my place. But people drive all over town to meet this guy, and I knew of people who would send their radios from interstate to him to work on. So anyway, I rang him up, and I met up with him, and I gave him my Uniden Pro 810E to have it modified. And anyway, so he'd take your radio, and 3 or 4 weeks later, he'd call you back and say, I'm done, come and meet me and bring some cash and you can get your radio back. So I met up with him one night. I gave him the radio, he modified it, and he put extra channels in it. So instead of having 40 channels, it now had 100. And that enabled me to go up to the back then famous channel 55 upper sideband, 27.555, which is where all the DX had been known to be. It must have been the bottom of the cycle, because I didn't make a lot of contacts up there. I heard a bit and worked a few, but mid-90s, which I think at that time might have been the bottom of the cycle anyway. At that particular time, I could be wrong. My old man was also into fishing, and he had a fishing boat. So I asked Ian to put the 27 megahertz marine frequencies in there as well. So if he was on a boat, we could get a hold of the old man. He did have a phone as well, a mobile phone, but you could just pick up the 2-way and catch him on the marine radio, which is pretty cool. Anyway, as I got into my late teens, other interests took over. Things like,
as they do,
things like going out with the mates, partying in nightclubs, and the CB radio was pretty much forgotten. Didn't get much use at all after that. 2005, I got married. We bought a house, and late in 2006, I remembered the CB. I must have gone to mum and dad's for dinner, and I saw it sitting there, and I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I remember that. And I said to the old boy, I said, oh, I might take the radio and the station master, if you don't mind, I'll set up at my place. He wasn't using it, so he said, yeah, go for it. Took it home, set it up. I quickly realised that CB radio wasn't for me anymore. It was just too much garbage on the frequencies. It didn't really appeal to me. Now, during my time on CB, I met a bloke named Dave. Back then, he was known as Overland Radio 566. He's now a Victor Kilo 5 Mike Romeo Delta, who you personally know as well, Hayden.
Yep.
And I've been mates with Dave for over 20 years. I got on the phone to Dave, and just after having set the CB up, and told him I wasn't really enjoying it. And he said to me, well, I'm now a ham. And I said, oh, wow. And he said, yeah, you don't need the Morse code anymore. There's a new foundation license. So this was very late in 2006. So I know the foundation license was released in 2005.
Yeah, I remember that. I think my first contact with Dave would have been about 2006 as well. So it would have been just after he got licensed. And it wasn't long after foundation license was introduced.
Yep, cool. So so Dave was into CB just like me, and he had a pretty nice setup. And anyway, so we started talking, and he told me about this foundation license, and no Morse code required anymore. And the rest is history. About 5 weeks later, I sat my foundation exam. Almost aced the exam. I got one question wrong, which I reckon I was correct, but the examiner said that the answer was incorrect. And soon after, I was licensed as Victor Kilo 5 Foxtrot Tango Delta Mike at the age of 26. That is pretty much my entry into amateur radio.
Well, it's a very much a path that I think a lot of people that would watch this video later on will say, yeah, that's the exact path that I took, or a very similar one as well. We've got a couple of comments in here. VK4CZ, well done, Theo, thumbs up, and a beer mug emoji. Jason Wallace, ZL2FT, started shortwave listening in the 80s as a kid, and then CB radio late 80s onwards, and then ham radio since 2000. Never looked back. Scott again, VK4CZ, I'll send you box loads of magazines, have piles of CQ and 7.3 mags in the shed. So I said to Scott, we might have to take you up on that one. Maybe that's a future video. Start to go back and look through some of the old magazines.
There's some great articles in those magazines, especially the radio reviews.
Yeah, well, they're still you know, still relevant with a lot of things that we do today, like antenna builds and things. Good evening to Paul Albers. God sounds familiar. So again, it's I think it was because what reminded me was the whole Dick Smith CB craze back in the 80s with he started to I think CB radio wasn't legal, or it wasn't being. I have to try and get my facts right here.
I think the story's in the 70s. It was illegal to be on CB.
And then Dick, he campaigned for ages, and then obviously started repairing radios and things, and then got CB radio in just about every vehicle that was on the road at the time, trucks and everything. GM4ZJI, morning, evening from sunny Scotland. Well, I'm glad that it's sunny somewhere. Was it sunny in Adelaide today?
Yes, it was. Yesterday it was very unsunny, but today it was very, very sunny.
It's always sunny in Adelaide. It's never sunny. Well, actually, it was quite a nice day down here in Tasmania as well. Paul, again, had to do Morse for the AOCP in 1990. I had to. I was fortunate enough that I didn't have to do Morse. I started at Novice Limited, which would have been. I can't remember when that was introduced, but it was just before the foundation license got introduced as well. Theo, are you involved in any radio clubs?
Yes, I am. I'm involved in AREG, which is looking rather groovy at the moment on the screen, thanks to my awesome green screen effects. So the Amateur Radio Experimenters group is who I'm involved with. I joined in 2013, which is hard to believe because that time has gone so fast. So this will be year number 7 for me in AREG. Joined in 2013, and a few years later, I joined the committee, and which is where I have remained ever since. So still a committee member, and really, really enjoy being a part of that. I spent several years as a ham, so on my own, so to speak. And there were those that you could speak to on the radio, but I couldn't really learn a lot from them in terms of advancing my radio-related skill. I could as an operator, but I really wanted to develop my experience and my knowledge more than just sitting behind a radio and talking into a microphone. And just to do that on your own is almost impossible. It was for me. So there's a handful of radio clubs in Adelaide. There's at least half a dozen that I can think of. And I went to a few of their meetings, and those clubs are great. They're they're decent clubs, and they do some cool stuff. But a lot of the majority of their members were a lot older than me. And I wanted to mingle with a few hams who were a little bit closer to my age group. And have a bit, someone who would have a bit more in common with radio and other things as well. So obviously, if they're closer to my age, we have some more interests and stuff like that. So I was introduced to AREG, and basically haven't looked back since. It's been a great club, and I really enjoy being a member. What I liked, they've got a really diverse membership. A lot of the members are extremely clever people. And very knowledgeable. Some of the smartest guys I've ever met are AREG members. Some of them worked in, they work or have worked in defence, police force. They're electrical and electronic engineers. So, as far as learning things from people, they're really cluey bunch of guys. But there's even guys who come from a non-technical background, such as myself. I mean, I dabble with computers, but I would say I'm in a technical background. So this really, really appealed to me. And obviously, you want to be able to go to someone when you've got questions, and these guys have the answers. Another thing that appealed to me about AREG is that they're really active. They've got pretty big focus on particular interests such as contesting. A lot of us are really into contesting and working DX, which is the two things that I really enjoy as part of this hobby. So that's the story on what club I'm involved with.
I'll put the link to AREG's website in the chat. Definitely check it out. We had a video, or we've had two videos now with two members of AREG. Mark, VK5QI, he was speaking about radio sons, and we hope to have him on the channel again soon to talk a little bit more about Project Horus, which is an AREG, another AREG project. And we also spoke with Grant, VK5GR, last week on another live stream. So if you haven't checked those videos out, check those out. But yeah, there are a couple of AREG members as well. So so being involved with the radio club and starting to getting interested in amateur radio, who would you say encouraged or motivated you in the hobby? So who were your Elmers or your mentors?
Look, there's a bunch of guys that come to mind, but to specifically mention just a couple who have been quite instrumental. Steve Adler, VK5 Sierra Foxtrot Alpha, he's one of them. He knows his stuff, as do a lot of these guys, but he also won the ARRL antenna design competition last year with his 160 meter dual turn loop. So he's one of them. Matthew Cook, VK5ZM, and Grant Willis, VK5GR, who you interviewed last Sunday, I think it was.
Yep.
Again, all AREG members, but didn't, not specifically for that reason, that I consider these guys to be my Elmers or my mentors. Also Tommy Horizakis, VK2IR, great bunch of blokes, great mates of mine. They're just a couple that, just to name a few, there are a couple that come to mind right now. Each one of these guys have been really instrumental to either motivating me or motivating me to attempt something new in the hobby, or just be there to answer questions. And it's amazing that these guys have all the answers. And I'll get into it later on, but when we built a new home and I was designing the shack, and I was up against challenges like, how do I get coax in the house without making a mess of the walls? And, what do I do about grounding and things like that? And these guys they just have all the answers. Obviously the experience is where it comes from. But it's good to have someone there. And this is why I joined a club, because you could just go to those guys and, they've got a mailing list. You've got a question, you throw a question up on the mailing list and bang, you've got an answer before you know it. And you've got guys who have just got so much experience and they can really help you. And so, yeah, these guys are really encouraging, and just a pleasure to have there for when you need a hand with something. Even when I was putting up my antenna, you had half a dozen guys put their hands up, and two of these guys, both Steve and Grant, were part of the team that came around and devoted a bit of their time to help me get my antenna up.
I think that's the key. If you're a new or prospective ham who wants to go for their license, then don't be afraid to go to your local club and just seek someone out and just say, hey, what's this about? Or I need a hand with this, or whatever the case is, because there's always someone that's willing to lend a hand. And if you're already well established in a radio club, to make sure that you provide that support and help to those who are starting, because as you would know too, Theo, that when you first start, everything's very daunting. You don't know how to do everything. Which is fine. It's not a problem, because that's the whole point of amateur radio is that we're there to learn. So the more that we can share the knowledge with others and new people in the hobby means that gradually it just gets all shared around. And as you say, you can walk into a club and just get help from anyone, really. And I did neglect to say at the start of the stream, you will have noticed in the background of Theo's video, he's got quite a few QSL cards, and I've noticed that it's still going. It hasn't gone round back to the start, so there must be an awful lot of QSL cards in that collection in the background.
I came prepared. There's a few there. I think I timed it to last. Hopefully, it will last till the end of the stream, but I've got a bunch of QSL cards. I really enjoy collecting them, and I just picked I had scanned quite a lot of them, and this is the majority of the ones I've scanned, but I've got tons of them in the drawer. I've got a lot of them in a photo album, a couple of photo albums. This particular room I'm sitting in right now, the walls are quite bare, hence the reason for me having the QSL cards up behind me. Otherwise, you'd have a pretty plain old white wall to look at. So I thought, how am I going to make that look less boring? But I do want to put some of these up in a frame at some point.
Yeah, and for our viewers, if you keep watching, you may see your QSL card might flash up on the screen too. You never know. I can't even remember if we've worked on the air or not. I'm sure we would have on 10 meters maybe.
I reckon there's a pretty good chance we did work on 10 meters.
Yeah, I myself, I haven't really been that fluent with QSL cards. I've had various different designs over the years, and I need to stick to a design and print them out. That's actually one of the things that I didn't have down here to discuss with QSL cards. Do you find you've got a standard QSL card, or you've just designed one that you've used for years? Or
yeah, look, I have. I did have one designed, which I did myself. I don't know how I did it because I'm not real good with graphic design, but I did one for my old call sign, Victor Kilo 5 Mike Tango Mike. And then when I upgraded in September of 2018, I haven't done a new one yet. I do need to get one done because I'm making contacts and I need to get a few cards out there. So yeah, I've got to get cracking and design a new card and then get it off to the printer and start sending a few out.
There's nothing quite like receiving QSL cards. Like they've got eQSL and things, but there's nothing quite like getting the card in the mail.
I get a kick from getting home after work and I go straight to the mailbox and opening it up to find an international envelope there. And you open it up and it's a card from someone you've made contact with. And particularly if it's a new country or if it's a really rare part of the world, I get an absolute thrill out of it. I still do.
I've got, yeah. Sorry, keep going.
Probably the ones I'm a little bit sick of getting are the ones from Japan because working JA from Australia is like working your next door neighbor. And,
yeah, there's a JA card right there.
Yeah, I get a ton of cards from Japan and I reply to them all, but yeah, sometimes you get an envelope in the mail or a few and they're all from JAs, or if you get a lot from the bureau and they're all JAs, you think, oh, bummer. You know, it's good to get something new. The one behind me at the moment, 3 Bravo 8 Charlie Foxtrot, was an absolute thrill. That was my first real DX that I worked when I first started working Morse code. And he was calling one night and I called him back and I couldn't believe that I worked him. And then I sent off for a card and he sent me that card back. So again, a real thrill to open up the letterbox and see that envelope sitting there.
Some of them, like I've just had a look at this JA one that I've got, or JI one that I've got. I can't, with the virtual, there we go. It's quite detailed, that, like, you know, some of them are really good. And I've got
it doesn't really work too well with the green screen effect, but there's a pile there that I still have to sort out.
There's another one, I2FAK. That was an EME one. And just for the purpose of this video and the fact that he's watching, I have to throw in that. That's a bit of an in-house joke, that one. So he'll appreciate that. So we've learned about involvement in the radio club and those who helped you out. Can you tell us now about some of your passions in amateur radio and what specifically do you enjoy about the hobby?
Look, what really drew me into the hobby was DXing, working distant stations. And
oh, sorry, we've just got one question before we continue. Paul, does he send IRCs with the card?
I used to send IRCs. A lot of operators now don't want them because their local postal office is no longer accepting them. Truth be told, I now have a QSL manager that looks after my cards for me. But when I was sending my own cards, I stopped sending IRCs because you go to qrz.com and a lot of operators will say no IRCs, but they'll quite happily accept a couple of US dollars. So I do have a stash of US $1 notes in the drawer. And if I do send off for a card myself, they'll get at least a couple of those in the envelope with my card.
Yeah, oh, that's good. Sorry, continue about, you were talking about your passions and interests in the hobby.
Yeah, look,
what drew you in?
my passion was working distance stations, being able to talk to someone across the other side of the world, knowing that a little signal came out of my antenna and bounced off the ionosphere and then back off the ground and ended up somewhere in Europe or in America or wherever, without any assistance in between. I mean, some people often ask, oh, does it go through satellites? And I go, no, it's completely wireless. It travels at the speed of light. And if you sit there and think about that for a minute, well, if I sit there and think about it, even to this day, it still intrigues me. I still love it. So working DX, working long distance is my passion. Now, I don't mind a rag chew, but what I really enjoy is working rate and being on the receiving end of a pile-up, so calling CQ and then having half a dozen or more guys just scream their call signs back at you, and you've got to try and pick one out of the noise. And I've operated before where there have been pile-ups where I can't pick a call sign out because there are that many people calling me back. Quite often that will happen from another mate's station who's got a bigger and better station than me, but it's happened even recently with, I've been calling on sideband or CW into Europe, short path one late evening, and you can't pick out a single call sign because there's so many guys that are hearing you and they're giving you their call sign. So eventually you wait until you hear either a number or a single digit, and then you say, right, I want that digit, that letter, and then eventually you get there. But I like being on the receiving end of a pile up and working lots of contacts in quick succession, but also enjoy a bit of a rag chew.
And what bands do you like DXing on?
Look, my favorite band is 10 meters. I like DXing on all bands, don't get me wrong, but I get a bit of a kick out of the 10 meter band, and still have fond memories of back in 2011 and 2012 where the last cycle we had, it was at its peak, and turning on the radio at this time of night and being able to work into Europe, and there'll be so many of them there. I get a real thrill out of it.
Yeah, I think that's another thing too with those that sort of started in CB that I've noticed, 27 meg CB, that is, they tend to gravitate towards the first amateur radio band, or the most favorite amateur radio band they've got is 10 meters, because it's so close to 27 megs and behaves very much in a similar fashion. And I know that I was because I sort of started with 27 megs at CB as well. And that was the same thing. 10 meters is one of the bands that there's just so many things that affect it. And when unfortunately, I haven't been licensed. I haven't been active while it's been at the peak of a solar cycle on 10 meters or 6 meters. So very much looking forward to the next peak of the solar cycle, because it's when the band really goes off.
It's good fun. A lot of people will get a kick out of 6 meters because it's, it doesn't come alive that often when to work big DX, and they call it the magic band, and I get a similar feeling with a similar thrill with 10 meters. It's a lot of fun, and maybe because it's a bit of a rare thing to work a lot of DX on 10, whereas on an evening you can turn on 40 meters or 20 meters and there's going to be an opening most of the time, but 10 meters is a little bit different. And
10 meters when sporadic ease happening in the summer, which happens every summer at least, it's almost like there'll be a station there and then it'll be gone. I think the next question that I was going to ask you, I'll remind myself to speak about 10 meters again. But so apart from 10, is there any other bands that you like operating on the DX on?
Look, not really. 10's my favourite, but I'm quite happy to operate on any band. 20's always a bit of a favourite of mine as well. It's a great band for DX, but even 40 meters, I'm not really very well set up for 80 meters. I've got a wire out the back which I can load up with the tuner, and it'll spray some RF out there somewhere, but I haven't been able to work a lot of DX on 80, but
160 seems to be a band that everyone likes to enjoy now. It's sort of made a bit of a comeback. It
has, but the problem with 160 is you either need a really big antenna or you need quite an efficient antenna. So again, for 160, I mentioned Steve Adler before, VK5 SFA, who designed a twin turn 160 meter loop, and it goes like a rocket. So, but I don't quite have the know-how of how to make one of those myself. I know he'd be very happy to sit there and help me do it, but again, it's just a matter of time. There's so many. The great thing about this hobby is there's so much you can do in the way of experimentation, and playing around with 160 meters is something that I will want to pick up at some point. I'd really like to try EME one day. That's on my bucket list. I think to be able to bounce a radio signal off the moon, I think that's the ultimate. One day I'll get there, but not anytime soon. But yeah.
So with your DXing, have you got a most memorable contact or contacts?
Probably one of the most memorable contacts I had was the first big DX that I worked when I was newly licensed as an F-call. I worked into Japan on 10 meters. Now, you know, if you would ask me now, Japan, well, no big deal, because like I said, it's like speaking to your next door neighbor. That's how easy it is. But when you're newly licensed at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, in 2007, which is when I got my license, I remember talking to a guy in Japan on 10 and got an absolute kick out of it. I remember
cycle would have been going on, either at its lowest or on the way down, wouldn't it?
It was pretty, yeah. Well, it peaked in 2011, 2012. So we were, you know, it wasn't great.
No.
And I remember working this Japanese guy on 10 meters, and I remember when I finished the contact, I took the headphones off and put the mic down, and I went into the kitchen where my wife was with, I think she might have been cooking dinner, and I remember her grandma was over, and I just told them, I said, I just spoke to someone in Japan, and I was really excited, and I think they were like, yeah, well, all right, great. But I still remember that day. I don't remember his call sign, but that's probably my most memorable contact. I still get a kick out of working the Europeans. Just a bit of fun. I don't know why. I've got some mates in Europe. I'm born in Australia, but Greek heritage, and I've got some Greek hams who are mates of mine. And if I work them, it's quite often a bit of a joy to work them. But yeah, as far as the most memorable contact goes, it's probably that guy in Japan on 10 when I was newly licensed.
Couple more comments here. GM4ZJI. In the UK, you're not allowed on 160 meters unless you have a medical condition worth talking about. ZL2FT. Remember last cycle peak working a JA pile up on 6 meters with a station master vertical through a manual tuner and 100 watts. Yeah, the JAs on 6 meters, I know when I've worked them, it'll be the same on 10 meters. As soon as you work one, that's it. You're set for the next hour, because they'll just be calling and calling, and you've got to turn the radio off because they'll just keep calling and calling and calling, which is great. It's a good thing. Speaking about the memorable contacts, because you jogged my memory with 10 meters. I remember a contact that I made probably about 3 or 4 years ago now on 10 meters, where a South African station was on 10 meters sideband, and I had a station master vertical and a few 100 watts, and he was weak and he was working the ZLs, and then he gradually got stronger and stronger. And if anyone's familiar with the way 10 meters can be, it can be there and then it'll just disappear again, in the space of a few minutes. I was working him for about 2.5 hours. I had to go away. I had tea. I come back. You're still there? Yep. And we just kept working, and he couldn't believe it. And the same with me. And it's just one of those things. I don't know. It's just that band. I mean, you could do it on 40 meters or something like that, most nights of the week, or 20 meters or whatever. But it's just the fact that on 10, it's just that extra bit of a challenge, isn't it?
I recall one evening, I don't know when it would have been, probably 2010 or 11. 10 was dead, but we happened to have I think there was a flare of some sort. I think it might have been an X-class flare, but I'm no expert on flares. But this one particular evening, 10 meters came alive, and I remember just working a guy in England on 10 meters at about 10 o'clock at night. It's something I wasn't used to, but they say radio is magic, and it's certainly a magical feeling when you get conditions like that. That don't come around every day, and you're talking to someone on the other side of the world on a frequency or a band you wouldn't typically expect it to be happening on. And I suppose that's the same thing with 6 meters.
Yeah, and I think it's also to getting an appreciation of how the band operates normally, and then when it finally does open, that's when it's your time to try and work it. And it's sort of you do need a lot of patience, but when it does happen, it's definitely rewarding.
It's very rewarding and it's a lot of fun. Quite often we'll send an email around to each other, particularly amongst the club reflector, to say that a particular station has come on, and I'll go running down the hallway to jump into the shack and try and work them. So as far as needing a lot of patience, I think my wife's got a lot of patience. Sometimes I test those patience a little bit too much, but you know, it happens and it's good fun.
So yeah, and talking about having to be there and being there at the right place, right time, has there been any rare or difficult to work DX that you can think of?
There's always rare DX, particularly when a DX expedition comes up, and there's been some really good DX expeditions lately to a lot of very rare places in the world to work, and I have struggled to work those. There are some which I wasn't able to work. There are some which I sat there for hours at night or whenever calling them, and I did manage to work them. Thanks to modes like FT8, that's made it a lot easier. But there has been times where there's been places where I just haven't been able to make contact with. So up until recently, from the time I got licensed, I've only ever had one vertical antenna and a wire antenna, and that was all I had to try and work the DX with, a dipole. So I've never had a directional antenna up until this year. So being able to work those stations was much harder. Then it's a little bit easier now, but it's still not that easy. I still work with just 100 watts. I don't have a power amplifier or anything like that. But I had my fun. I've now worked 215 countries, consisting of all the continents, a bunch of remote islands, and that's part of the joy of what I do, is the challenge. I could pick up a phone or I could pick up Skype and talk to someone across the other side of the world, but there's no challenge in that. I compare ham radio to, it's like fishing. You could go out and cast a rod, and at a given time, you've got a pretty good idea when you're most likely to catch something, and you kind of know what you're going to catch. And it's a bit like radio. I know that if I turn the rig on now, I can pretty much work into the States on 40 meters. You kind of have an idea, but you still get a thrill of pulling that fish out of the water. But then there'll be days when the fish just aren't biting, and that's exactly like it is with radio. So it's a challenge, and that's what I enjoy about it.
I got a couple of comments. One here from Nick. Hi, Dad.
Okay, that's my son.
Yeah.
Hi,
so
Nick.
is he a prospective ham maybe?
He hasn't shown much interest in it. He knows my call sign. When I told him this was on tonight, he went and fired up YouTube on the TV and typed in my call sign to try and find this stream, and I had to tell him, no, it's VK7HH you need to type in.
Well, if they put in your call sign, it'll probably still show up as well. But
I've got some photos of him behind the radio when he was about 3 or 4 years old with the headset on, and it's quite funny. When he was about 2, he used to hear me calling CQ contest. And I used to say CQ contest, Victor Kilo 5 Mike Tango Mike contest. I gave him an old handheld, and he used to walk around the house and he used to say exactly that. Look, he hasn't really shown any interest. If he decides one day he wants to give it a go, I'll be more than happy to show him the ropes. But at the moment, nah, not really.
There you go, Nick. We'll look forward to you picking up the radio a little bit more often. There's a challenge for you. It'll be good. Paul. Again, yes, the true heroes are the wives and their tolerance. So I guess there's a shout out to your wife there.
Definitely.
So yeah, rare and difficult to work DX. You mentioned the analogy of a fisherman. Always trying to describe amateur radio to someone who's never been interested in it is a difficult thing, because they, as you say, if you don't get the sense for it, they just, why don't you just pick up a phone? But it's a little bit more than that, because the technology, so for instance, behind a phone, behind Skype, that sort of thing, at the end of the day, if you really want to learn about how it works and how signal A is getting from A to B, then you can learn it with amateur radio. And the fishing analogy is a good one because, you know, some fishermen there'll be different types. They'll be interested in all different types of fishing, fly fishing, you know, bait fishing, whatever the case is. They could just walk down to the store and pick up a fish if they wanted to. But that's not the point. The point is that they take the time. It gives them a sense of achievement, a bit of relaxation, whatever the case is. And, you know, they build their own rods, they build their own flies. So it's the similar thing with amateur radio too. We could just pick up a phone, but we learn a little bit in the process. There's also a hi dad from a constant shimmer. Probably another one of your children. Oh, I think you've gone muted. Have you run out of?
No, hang on. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, that was my daughter. So yep. One of my two daughters having some fun on YouTube from the sound of it.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, the amateur, creates the infrastructure for the contact phones. You have to pay for it.
That's exactly right.
So portable operation. I understand that you're interested in portable, running portable.
Yeah, I haven't been able to go portable for a little while, but I love going portable. I find it really relaxing. Just being able to set up on a beach or, you know, and close to seawater or on top of a really big hill, or even just in the bush somewhere away from home, away from the suburban QRM, away from the interference that we get here at home, away from the power lines where things become a lot clearer. Cold beer in one hand, microphone in the other. Absolutely love it. It's, you know, particularly, you know, if you're going camping or something, throw up a dipole into a tree, set up a radio off a battery. It's quiet, it's whisper quiet. You can hear the weakest signals out there. Whereas here in the suburbs, I really struggle with the weak signals. And to go out there, set up a deck chair, a little table, have a HF radio set up. It's something I've always enjoyed. But as I said, lately, it's just something I haven't really had a lot of time to do. But going portable is something really high on my list. I absolutely love it.
And so and obviously you go portable, so you'll do HF and VHF, UHF as well, I guess.
I don't really, I don't get into the HF, sorry, into the VHF and the UHF much at all, but the HF definitely. We've had some outings. I've got some photos here which I'll put up on the screen in a little while, and actually I'll see if I can fire them up now.
Sure.
Let's have a look here. Let's see if this works. So this is I think this was Largs Bay. Just here in Adelaide, just on the beach, you know, a couple of chairs, a little table, the squid pole, and you know, we were working around the world on 20 and 40 that particular evening. It's just really peaceful and it's very, very relaxing, I find. And like I said, you take a couple of cold beers with you and it's even better. There's another view.
Oh, yeah. 7 megs on the beach. 7
megs. It's great if the 7130 DX net comes up and they know you're portable. It's, you know, there's people always wanting to work you there. Little old school netbook, which had ham radio deluxe running for logging.
Yep.
This one's not quite portable, but it's mobile operation near the seawater. That's a lot of fun as well.
Looks like a whip on the car.
That's a Diamond 20 meter monobander. I've got 20, 15 and 40 meter monobanders in the boot, in the trunk of that car. And I've worked all over the world on those antennas from the car. That's another thing that will bite you hard is mobile HF DXing, a lot of fun. This was one of my very first attempts at going portable. This was for the John Moore Field Day, probably back in 2000 and I don't know, maybe 10. Yeah, just the squid pole there.
It's interesting. Is that a 2 meter, like a circular loop antenna or something?
Yeah. So this chap actually was at this spot when we got there. On John Moore Field Day. This is in a place called Maiponga, which is about 60 kilometres south of Adelaide. It's got quite a bit of elevation, and we went there. This fellow was already there, and he was only operating on the higher bands. So he said, look, if you want to set up HF, go for it. It's not going to be an issue for me. And we did just that. Worked a few stations, had a bit of fun, and that's just the radio. There is an old Kenwood TS130S stacked up on a couple of phone books for height, and the tuner on top. And you know, down here is an old UPS battery which I wired in parallel, 8 sealed lead acid batteries, and that's how we operated portable that day. Had a heap of fun, and again, going out there in where there's no noise and you get a bit of height as well, and you can easily work the world without much effort. Same spot. Actually, this is just down the road from that spot, but
it's a nice view, isn't it?
Yeah. So that there, that view right there is, well, you can't see it, but north of that view is Adelaide. This is the southern suburbs. It's Selix Beach, Silver Sands,
yep,
and Aldinga. But
I think I may have been down that way, but yeah.
That's a fantastic spot because it's peaceful, it's quiet. You got all that salt water there to help reflect your signal. And on this particular occasion, and again, I don't remember when this was. This might have been 2012 or 13. It was, we were there for, this was just a few days after Christmas, actually. Later that evening, I don't know, 6 or 7 o'clock, I worked into Algeria on 10 meters on that Hexbeam there. That's a folding portable Hexbeam. And yeah, he came up and managed to work him, and we just couldn't believe it. So more 10-meter magic. Of course, the portable operation operators need to be fed. So this was a mate of mine's barbecue, but you know, a few hamburgers on the go. Can't go hungry when you're operating portable.
No, it's always essential.
You must have the tomato sauce to go on the burger, or the ketchup, as our friends in the States would call it. And that's that view again.
Yeah, nice.
I trust you can see all of this properly.
Yeah. No, it's coming through well.
So once again, the old TS130S, which was a great little radio. I do regret selling it now, but I sold it to free up funds for another project. But fantastic little radio.
As you always do, I think we've all had rigs where we've sold them before and then regretted it later.
This is one of those rigs where I did regret selling. It was a great rig. And I do remember specifically in this spot, you plug in your antenna, turn on the radio, and you turn up the volume because you can't hear anything. All that static you hear at home, you can't hear it. So you turn your volume up and you start calling CQ, and then all of a sudden you get this big loud station come back to you, almost blow your eardrums because you got the radio turned up so loud. And that's because there's just no noise when you go portable. If you pick a good spot, you just don't hear any noise. This particular setup was club setup for the John Moore Field Day. That's just me doing some contesting there. That was a 40-meter station. And again, from that same spot, I think that's all of the portable photo. Anzac Day from the same spot, but this was Anzac Day 4 or 5 years ago. Again, the TS130S. Conditions were rubbish that morning. We had a flare and it wiped out HF, but managed a few contacts there. And that's my other John Moore Field Day setup from probably 2 or 3 years ago. The good old Yaesu FT-857,
yeah.
Great little radio. I've got that in my car. And the LiPo battery there. And that's the that was the setup, and a few more photos. And that's portable operation, and absolutely love it. But at the moment, I just haven't had the time for it.
So one of the things we were also going to talk to you about were some of your achievements. Now, I understand one of your achievements is the LOTW Mixed DXCC Award.
Yes, so that took me a fair bit of work, and again, because my antenna setup wasn't too good, it took me a while to work those stations. But it's one thing to work the stations; it's another one to get the damn things confirmed. There are a lot of stations out there who still won't upload to Logbook of the World and confirm. So,
but for those that are not familiar with that, did you want to briefly explain the process of what that actually is?
Okay, so Logbook of the World is an online logging platform where you can upload your logs. So if I work a particular station, I upload my logs, he uploads his logs. The server will, if the server finds a match, it will confirm that DXCC entity or slot for you. And once you get this particular award is the mixed DXCC. So this particular award confirms contact with two-way contact with 100 countries, at least 100 countries. And it's always those last 2 or 3 that take forever to get, because it's the most populated areas that you work first. And then after that, you used to try and work the least populated areas, and there's always less operators there. So that's what Logbook of the World is. There is another way to do it, and that is to collect the cards and send them into a checker. But I thought I was just going to do this via electronic confirmations only. But in 2014, I finally, so I had been licensed for 7 years at that point. I'd made over 3,800 contacts, which probably wasn't a lot, but for me, it was a fair few. I finally was able to confirm the 100th country. I got a little piece of paper, which I have framed on the wall here in front of me. And it's something I'm quite proud of. So yeah, as I said earlier, having just a simple vertical antenna and a wire antenna made that quite difficult. Whereas those with Yagis will be able to make those contacts a little bit easier. You point the antenna in the direction you want the signal to go, and if there's a path there, you work it a lot easier. Whereas with a fixed antenna with a dipole that's fixed in one particular orientation, it's a little bit harder. So, and given the fact that I've got the noise here at home, just made it another challenge on top of that. But yeah, so I got the piece of paper in the mail. I sent off for it. It came a few weeks later in a little tube, and I framed it, and yeah, quite proud of it.
Well, that's good.
That answers the questions on Logbook of the World.
Oh yeah, and to get 100 countries, as you say, it's no mean feat to try and do that. And I think that, what's that, 38 for every 38th contact you've worked a new country. So that's it's good going. So you briefly touched upon contesting. So you enjoy contesting, and have you received any awards or achievements through contesting, and how do you enjoy that?
I love contesting, and it comes down to working a lot of stations. The bands come alive when there is a contest. You might think that the conditions bands are dead and the conditions are no good, and then all of a sudden you have a contest and the bands come alive with all this DX to be worked. Particularly rare parts of the world where you wouldn't often work. People will travel to these rare parts of the world. There's a big station in Africa, Delta 4 Charlie, and you know, a ton of guys will travel there and set up and work from that station for the contest. And you just wouldn't normally work that part of the world during any other time. But when the big contests are on, the bands come alive and the contacts have come flying through. I haven't won any contests, and I don't enter them to win them. I enter them for the participation and for the fun, and I get a real thrill out of just working the contest. But my favorite contest is the Remembrance Day contest. There's no DX to be worked. It's only the Australian and New Zealand contacts that count. But you speak to a bunch of guys who you know, we often know a lot of each other, but even if we don't, it's just a good contest is to say hello and 73 and thanks for the contact and move on. So I did enter, the one I gave a really good shot on was last year, the Oceania DX contest in the CW category. I operated for 21 out of the 24 hours. So I decided to have 3 hours sleep. Actually, I had 2 hours sleep, to be honest, and then 1 hour was sitting in front of the couch just to have a bit of a break, but I didn't sleep. Worked a bunch of contacts. I think the logs haven't come back confirmed, but I think unofficially, I think I'm running 3rd or 4th, maybe 4th in that contest. So if I get a certificate back from that, I'll be thrilled. But that was a Morse code contest. So I made the decision to really, I'd been playing with Morse code for probably quite a few years, but a lot of it was with the aid of a computer decoder. And probably 18 months ago, not even, February last year, I made the decision that I was going to ditch the decoder, and I haven't used it since. And I started practicing every day and trying to get my receiving speed up. And now I participate in Morse code contests, and I get a real buzz out of it. But yeah, I really enjoy contesting.
See, that's quite amazing, really, because you were talking about when you first were interested in CB radio, and then you looked at ham radio, and then you saw that you needed CW or Morse to do that. It put you off, but now many years later, now that you've become licensed, you've got interested in it. You've sort of how do you put it? You know, just had a bit of a taste there. Now all of a sudden you're interested in CW and working that, and it's the same too. I think that CW is still one of the many things that is quite enjoyable in the hobby for everyone to learn.
So something else that I learnt. So when I first became licensed, it was all voice that I was interested in. Voice contacts. Had no interest in digital contacts. Had no interest in Morse code. What I realized back then, I had a couple of kids at that point, and they were young. And once the kids go to bed, you can't scream into a microphone because you're going to wake them up. And if you wake up those kids, one, you're going to have a very upset wife, and two, you're not going to get any sleep because the kids won't want to go to sleep. So I thought, how am I going to work DX without waking up these kids? And then I started looking into working digital modes. And what I realized was you don't need to have the volume up to be able to work digital. So I started playing with PSK and Richie, and I realized, hey, I can work a lot more DX than just on plain old sideband. So, you know, that the DX count started going up with the digital modes. And then I realized there was a lot more DX to be worked. Eventually, I started playing with Morse code, and I knew all the letters, but I couldn't receive it fast enough to do it again without a computer decoder. But anyone out there that wants to increase their DX tally, what you will realize is there's a bunch of DX to be worked, a whole lot more to DX to be worked, especially on digital and on CW. So it's particularly easier to work those DX contacts on those modes, whereas with voice, it's a little bit harder. So if there's anyone out there who likes working DX, consider giving, if you don't already, consider giving digital a go, or consider trying to take up Morse code. It's not difficult. It just takes a bit of practice, like anything. And 5-10 minutes a night of practice is all you need to learn the code, and you'll find eventually, like anything, it just comes to you and you get better and better at it. And there's a heap of DX to be worked in using those modes.
I think ultimately too, no matter what mode you're using, as long as you get on the radio and start making contacts is the main thing too. And then you tend to migrate between the modes too, as you know, depending on what the interest is.
Your interests evolve, and just like the hobby evolves. You know, when you're first licensed, you're only going to take on one or two things at a time. It's too much to try and give it all a go. And that's like I said, you know, I want to try EME and I want to try 160 meters down the track. We can't do it all at once. But as you become a more experienced operator and you get a bit of a taste for it, you want to try new things, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we'll move on a little bit more. So what, well, we're all in isolation at the moment. So what current projects are you working on?
At the moment, I'm not working on any projects. In 2017, we demolished the house that we had lived in for 11 years. It was a tiny little house, but it had a decent sized block. And we rebuilt a larger home, and I always wanted to put up a Hexbeam antenna. So like I said earlier, I've never had directional antennas. So once we moved into the new house that we had just built, I wanted to put up a Hexbeam, and I wanted to homebrew my Hexbeam. That's what I had decided. I go out and buy a Hexbeam, just like you can go and buy fish from the market, but some people like fishing for their own fish. So I thought, I want a Hexbeam and I want to homebrew it. So July last year, I started working on building my own 6-band Hexbeam with the advice from a couple of other guys here in VK who had homebrewed theirs, who probably should mention because they've given me a lot of help in the way of answering questions. Steve, VK4 Kilo Uniform Sierra, and also Jonathan, VK7 JON, Juliet Oscar November, both built their own Hexbeams, and I bombarded them with questions, and they were happy to come back and give me answers every time. They're probably sick and tired of me after a while. But look, they gave me plenty of advice, and so I started in July last year homebrewing this Hexbeam, and in September I finished it, but I wasn't able to get it high enough in the air to be able to test. You can't test an antenna while it's 3 or 4 feet off the ground because you're surrounded by things around you, and particularly in my little, what's now a little backyard, because the house has taken up all the space. I've got fencing all around me. Couldn't get the antenna up in the clear. I didn't have a tower to be able to put the antenna on. So I built this antenna and then I packed it back up again, and it went back in the shed for 3 or 4 months until January this year, when we were able to get it up in the air, and it performed as we expected. It actually performed much better than I expected. I didn't really know what to expect because I've never had a beam before. I've used beams before at mates' places and during contests, but not long enough to really get an understanding for what they're used for and how good they are. So I really didn't know what to expect. Put up the Hexbeam, started working DX, but it just became a lot easier once it got up in the air and I was able to point it in the direction I wanted to work. It became a lot more apparent how good these things really are. And like I said, it exceeded my expectations, and being able to turn it in one direction and hear a signal, and I still do it. I've only had it up, since February, but I still do it. It still amazes me, and turn it against that signal and hear it fade out, which I still think is really quite amazing. So going from a vertical antenna and a wire dipole to going to this directional Hexbeam, and even though it's a 2-element antenna, I think it's quite amazing. So, if there's anyone out there who wants to, particularly those who have a small block like me and they want a directional antenna with a small footprint, I only strongly recommend giving the Hexbeam some thought. For a 2-element antenna, it's certainly got a lot of bang for its buck. And because I homebrewed it, gave me even more satisfaction. So yeah, look, no other projects on the go at the moment, but just sitting here enjoying using the antenna and working a lot of DX with it.
So so we were talking about your Hexbeam. Do we want to do a bit of a tour now of your antennas and shack through your photos?
Sure. Let's do it. I'll start with a few happy snaps of the Hexbeam and then we'll get into the shack. Where are we? Let's start here. I think it's that one. So can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so that's how the Hexbeam started. The base plate, because I'm not a welder and I don't have any skills in welding or equipment to weld with, I had that bit made up professionally. The rest I pretty much did myself. So that's the base plate. That's pretty much the finished product sometime later in my backyard. And that antenna has 2 elements, full-size elements that covers 20 meters, 17 meters, 15, 12, 10, and 6. So 2-element 6-band antenna. That's the finished product up there in the air. That's at 10 meters height.
I was going to say, yeah.
It's at 10 meters height. There are plans to put up a freestanding tower, but
how wide is that? Is the antenna from one side to the other?
That has a 6.5 meter diameter.
Yep.
And my particular antenna is a little bit lighter than the commercial product is. So I estimate that's probably only at around, mine's probably 6 or 7 kilos. You can buy these professionally or commercially manufactured from quite a few overseas manufacturers. I think they're about the 12 kilo mark. I skimped a little bit. Well, what happens was this needs some clips to hold those wires in place. I bought what was advertised as stainless steel clips online. Turned out they were very, well, they weren't very stainless, that's for sure. So I think this turned out to be a little bit lighter for that reason. But it's, this thing, I can hold it up with one arm, and it's really easy to put up in the air. It's got a really low wind resistance. So they're meant to do quite well in storms. We haven't had any real bad weather yet, so I'm sort of a little bit nervous when we get a storm. But the other 2 guys here in VK who have homebrewed their Hexbeams have said, yeah, look, theirs does really well in the winds.
Well, so while you zoomed up too, we've got, so VK2 LHC says, what are the supports made from?
Okay. These supports are, what do you call them? Squid poles from Haverford's in Sydney. These are the heavy duty 5 meter versions, which I cut down to size. So if you are interested in manufacturing your own Hexbeam, there is a website online that's really, really good. It's hex-beam.com. So hex-beam.com. That website is created by Leo, VK5IR, who actually sells a commercial product, but he's happy to give you the recipe to make your own. And at the bottom of each page, he basically says, to save yourself some time, you can buy one from here. So, you know, he's doing it to make $1, but, you know, it's a fantastic site. So yeah, as I was saying, that antenna is at 10 meters height. Unfortunately, it's on a guide mast at the moment. There are plans to get a freestanding mast in there at some point, but I need to save a few more pennies before I can do that. One thing that's not in the picture, there is a rotator at the bottom of that mast, and it rotates from the bottom. So I am able to rotate it. And again, there's another picture of it. Yeah, and so that's what the Hex looks like when it's on the ground, but 6.5 meters diameter.
A quick shout out to Bob G. Good evening, Hayden and Theo from Bob ZL2WN. Good to see our Kiwi viewers are still awake. Oh yeah, that's how it's bolted to the plate.
Yeah. And so that's me holding it up.
Oh yeah, that gives some sort of perspective now of the size. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I suppose, in some regards, like even though that's a small backyard, once it's up in the air, it's still fairly compact, like compared to say a large HF, you know, wire dipole or something.
It's very compact because of its design. So I could go and get a beam and put it up, but its footprint is going to be a lot larger. And it's obviously, you know, I've got to try and keep it within the perimeter of, or the boundaries of my house to keep the neighbors happy. But whereas this has only got it's got a small footprint, and it's a solid performer. So you may have realized.
What are the main bands? What are the main bands that you use this on?
I've used it on all bands, and I use it daily on all bands. So like I said, 20 meters, 17, 15, 12, 10, and 6. I've made contacts on all those bands, and it's performed better than I expected. It's quite directional. We've calculated front to back ratio of 20 dB, which is what the textbook says. And I've got a mate who lives up in the hills, and we did a little test one day, and he fired a 1 watt CW signal at me on all bands. And I, recorded the S meter reading, and then I turned away from him, and we recorded the S meter readings, and we recorded roughly 20 dB front to back, which is what it should be. And so
it's very good for a HF beam. Yeah,
for 2 elements, I think it's damn good. What was I going to say? Yeah, so you may notice that a lot of the DXpeditions are now using hex beams, and the reason for that is first of all, they perform really well. 2, they're light, so they're easy to transport, and they're easy to erect. So the Hexbeam is gaining a lot of popularity. They've been around for years, but they're becoming a lot more popular now. I can go and buy one. They're about anywhere from, depending who you buy from, anywhere from $1,200 to $1,600 Australian landed, including taxes and freight. But I decided to build mine, and cost me half of that. And I get the thrill of knowing I made it myself. So that's the Hexbeam shack. Where do we go with the shack? This is the latest photo of the shack. Excuse the middle screen. I had some work stuff up on the screen that day. I thought better protect my place of employment. But the latest shack, look, it's pretty modest. It's an ICOM IC-7410, which is the weapon of choice on HF. The little rig down here in the bottom left-hand corner, which is switched off in this photo, is a Kenwood TM-V7A. It's a dual band, 70 centimeter and 2 meter rig. And yeah, the tuner there I use for the lower bands. I use that for 40 meters and for, and 30 really is what I tune it up on. I can, like I said earlier, I can get it to work on 80, but it doesn't work very well. I do have enough room for a 40 meter dipole in the backyard. However, I don't have enough height on it at the moment. And so even though the antenna is resonant on 40, it needs the tuner to make the radio happy. Once I get a tower,
how do you go? Do you have any height restrictions in Adelaide where you live for antennas?
Okay. Our height restrictions are, so general for the average man on the street, it's 7.5 meters. For the licensed amateur, it's 10 meters to the top of the structure, including the antenna. So a very funny story is when we first put my Hexbeam up, it had been up for 3 business days before a letter came in the mail from the council to say, we've had reports of an antenna / tower erected in your backyard, and please contact us to arrange inspection. So anyway, and the council officer was friendly enough to put in an attachment from the Radio Communications Act advising that, you've got to be within 7.5 meters unless you meet these exceptions, which one of them was you could go to 10 meters if you're an amateur. So I rang the chap back. He was really nice, and he said to me, how high is it? I said, it's at the time it was at 8 meters. And I said, but I am an amateur. And he goes, oh, great. He goes, can you send me your license? I said, yep. What's your email address? And I emailed him the license. That call lasted for 67 seconds. I haven't heard from him since. So obviously I've got a neighbour there who didn't quite appreciate the look as much as I did of this thing in my backyard. But yeah, we can go to 10 meters in Adelaide without council or development approval as long as we are licensed.
Oh, that's good. I haven't heard the license bit, but that's good that you're allowed that sort of height. So yeah, that's
I know
that's
Victoria is 8 or 8.5.
Yeah, I think ours in Tasmania, it depends on council to council, but generally it's at 6 meters from the highest point of attachment. So if it's attached to a building, the highest point of attachment to that building, it's 6 meters up from there. But depends on where you live. If you're a little bit more rural, you get away with things a little bit easier.
Yeah. Well, I think if it's attached to the house, you're only allowed to go about 2 meters above the roof line. So if I did have a visit from the council officer at the time, I would have had to take down my station master, because that was just attached to the mounts they put foxtail dishes on, the gutter mounts. Yes, they go under they attach to the eaves. I had my station master on one of those. They're 5 meters long. But anyway, look, the guy was really friendly. He didn't bother to take it any further. As soon as I emailed him my license, that was the end of that. So that's the shack, the logbook of the World DXCC certificate on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And the rotator there to rotate the hex. Here's another view of it with one of my favorite beers. The pan adapter. So a few years ago, I tapped into the IF of the 7410, and there is a RTL dongle attached to the first IF of that radio, which allows me to run the pan adapter. So basically, if I see signal, this is not a really good example, but if I see a signal there, I can pretty much click on it and the radio will tune to that frequency. So it's great for knowing what's on the band without having to spin the dial up and down the band all the time. And I know the new modern rigs will already have that built in, but mine didn't. So, which I thought was quite good.
Makes things a whole lot easier, isn't it, when you can see the whole band?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's hard to go back to a radio without a pan adapter once you do. There's another view, the little bencher CW paddle down there. Something I have to work on. I've worked on my CW receiving. My CW sending is not good. I can send my call sign and a few things on the paddle, but other than that, I'm not real great on it. So a lot of obviously all my CW contesting has been done via computer as far as the keying goes, but I do need to practice on my hand sending. Another shot of the hex, which we've already seen. So here's when we built the house. It's great to be able to set up a shack when you are building the house. And what we did here is this is some electrical conduit being put into the timber there, so with some ropes in there, so I can easily feed coax into the shack. And again, a lot of this came from help and advice from AREG members, because I said to them, I'm setting up a new shack. How the hell do I get coax in there without drilling through walls and things? And they said, right, this is what we're going to do. So I said to the my cable and my data cable, I actually put this in for me, and the builder said, "Yep, you can do that." I had to tell them I was doing it because obviously before handover, you're not really allowed to touch the house. But I said to them, "This is what I want to do," and the builder said, "Yep, sure." So as I had my data cabling done, I had those 4 conduits in there, which 2 of the 4 have got LMR 400 running in there, and the other 2 are empty. This is my wall plate for my coax. This is how I got the coax into the shack. Basically down there, it sits behind the desk. Tape the coax to the rope, pull the coax through, and there's the plate. And I put a little sticker on the end for the monster antenna, which I won't be having, but I just thought it's wishful thinking to have a big step IR or monster there. That's the wall plate. So the coax goes through the roof, and then it comes down this pipe out of the eave and down through that pipe there. And then you'll see on the next picture, the coax then
just looks like a regular downpipe there.
What that was, it looks like a regular downpipe. That's air conditioning conduit. So I thought, how am I going to do this without making it messy? And this is what was suggested to me. So I just went to the local air conditioning supplier, material supplier, and yeah. So I
run plenty of cables through it as well, because it's nice size.
It is. It's these that conduit there, that orange conduit at the bottom has got large sweeping bends to feed the thick coax. So LMR 400 is not very flexible. So it was suggested use large sweeping bends. I think that's 80 mil conduit there from memory. And there's a rope there, and that's how we did it. And I've had to feed coax through that a few times now, and you just tape it to the one end of the rope and pull it through, and it's an absolute breeze to pull coax through, and there's no coax going across the air on catenary wires and things like that. It's all underground and well hidden. So I broke my back digging trenches before the grass went down and the concrete went down. But again, this is all through advice through fellow club members.
Do it once properly too. You don't have to worry about it again.
Exactly. And I had to avoid stormwater pipes as well.
I did see that though.
So lucky on the front yard. I was putting a power run in for an electric gate, and managed to hit the stormwater pipe. But anyway, it was before concrete went down, so that was an easy fix. That was the first antenna I had up once the new house was built, just a dipole on the end of the squid pole. And that's the primary reason I haven't been able to go portable for a while, is because that antenna is still up, being supported by that particular squid pole. That's a linked dipole, which is my primary portable antenna. And there's just a little Anderson power pole clips along the way. So, you just lower it, disengage the one you want to operate on, and you've got a resonant antenna across several bands. But for a while, until the Hexbeam went up, that was my primary antenna in this particular QTH. And so it's still there. I still use that on 40 and 30 meters. Eventually I'll get probably a trapped dipole up or something, and I'll be able to take that down and start going portable again. Homebrew flower pot antenna. It's a dual band 2 meter and 70 centimeter antenna, just for getting into the local repeaters and things like that. Seems to do the job pretty well. The old shack, the Great Wall of QSL, as I used to call it.
Wow.
Which I used to like showing off.
Yeah, and there's your DXCC award there too in the middle.
Yeah. So that was the old shack in the little house that we demolished. A few QSL cards. The old dipole, that's a Homebrew off-center fed dipole. So the benefit of that was I had a resonant antenna on all bands from 40 through to 6 meters without the need of a tuner, because it's an off-center fed dipole. It worked extremely well. I worked a ton of DX on it. It's at about 7 meters height. And for what it was, it worked really, really well. And that's the same backyard that we were looking at a minute ago. So you can see I had lots of free space for hanging antennas, where it's a different story now. So we demolished the little house and built the new house, which took up a lot more of that backyard. But if you want to put up a dipole and you want it to cover a few bands, give the off-center fed dipole some thought. You won't need a tuner.
And how high have you got the off-center fed dipole there in that photo?
That's about 7 meters.
7 meters, yeah.
Yeah. And there we are again. That's, yeah. So that's the shack.
Yeah, excellent. It looked very, very good and nice and compact. It was good to see how you ran the cables too. I think you've hit the nail on the head there too, with a bit of advice and a little bit of preparation beforehand goes a long way for if you ever want to upgrade later on or run new cables or whatever you need to do. You don't have to worry about sticking it in a big bundle and up there and, you know, as you say, a container across the tower or whatever, and it looks unsightly. So
yeah, and look, these are things I haven't been able to think up on my own. So once again, you know, you get a few club members around and you say, right, this is what I'm doing. How are we going to do it? And they know the answer straight away because they've had to do it before. Some of them have worked in the field of communications before. Others have just been a ham long enough to know how to do it. And they said, well, you know, before you put your concrete down, dig your trenches, put the conduit in there, leave some rope in there, and it just works brilliantly.
Well, thank you for the interview this evening, Theo, and for showing us through your shack and
thanks for having me on.
A bit of a history. Yeah, it's been great, and I see your QSL cards are still going in the background there. So there's been plenty of.
I think they're due to finish very shortly. I might have to restart the video.
It was good timing. So, yeah, no, thanks again for showing us through, and we've had a couple of comments come through again. VK2LHC, good night all. Thanks for the show and sharing the Hexbeam info. I think that the Hexbeam stuff is very interesting. I reckon that there seem to be a good antenna. I've watched quite a few videos on YouTube with them, and they seem to be a nice compact option for people for portable or for small backyards and things like that. So might even be something that I might look at, because we spoke about earlier on how you start in radio and then you end up going back to something that you started doing ages ago. So I haven't really been on HF active that much, but I want to get back into it again. So maybe a Hexbeam might suit for me. So
you've done pretty well with your microwave stuff, though. I've enjoyed watching your videos.
Well, the microwave stuff was again a thing where I always wanted to do it, but I never really knew how to. And then I spoke to ones in the know who had been doing it, started to build some things up myself, and then gradually you learn. And I mean, I don't know everything at all. There's still heaps and heaps to learn, but I think it's just, yeah, if you get out, you have a crack and have a go at what you want to do, and try out an aspect of the hobby that you haven't done before, then
it's all about
pick it up.
experimentation.
That's right.
One thing that interests me that I think you're the one that did it. Are you the one that's responsible for the repeater linking down there in VK7?
Yes, guilty as
charged. I would love to know more about that. If you did a video on that one day, apparently what I've been told is it's quite simple, but I'd love to know how you did it.
I did do a video. There is a live stream video that I did a little while ago explaining on how the system worked. There is a little bit more. I sort of want to do a little bit more hands-on videos of that. Obviously, with the whole situation that we're in at the moment, it's a bit difficult to do. But yeah, it's one of those things where that's interested me, and you've got to keep maintaining it after it's been done.
Yeah.
Which can take a lot of time and a lot of resources, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing. I sort of mine was strange. I did a little bit of HF, then got straight into repeaters, VHF, UHF, and now want to go back to HF again. So yeah, it's sort of a big round circle. But definitely, I think your next goal of EME will be a very good one.
Yeah, that won't be happening anytime soon, but I do want to give it a try. I know. I think Grant touched on it when he spoke to you last weekend, and I was fortunate enough to be able to go with him on one of the times he was out there testing the gear before he went to Tonga, and so it's a real thrill to send a signal. It's a thrill to have someone come back to your CQ call, let alone when it's going via the moon. So I think it was awesome. That's something I definitely want to try for myself one day.
And saying that too, like via the moon's, 300 and 60,000 kilometers one way. So it's quite a long distance. So yeah,
it's a long distance. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks again, Theo, and
thanks, Hayden.
And as I said, leave a comment below what you thought of the stream. Maybe some comments for Theo. What you thought of and maybe even if you've had any success with hex beams. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.
Before you go, if anyone's interested in seeing more photos of the hex beam or the shack fit out, if you look me up on qrz.com, I've got links there to some Google albums, so you'll be able to see more photos of those in case you want to know more.
I think there's a link in the description. I think I put to your QRZ, so yeah, check that out. No worries. Thanks, Theo.
Thanks, Hayden. It's been great.
See ya.